Hi there Patreon ladies and gentlemen. So I was looking up at my wall. I was doing some work on my computer behind me, and I was looking up at my wall and I was contemplating how much I like that sword, the so-called Henry V sword. For those of you who don't know, this is made by Mark Vickers of St George Armoury, and it's a super nice sword. It has a hollow pommel. I'll just mention some of the key features. So it's modelled on a sword which is in Westminster Abbey and is commonly known as the Henry V sword. I'll talk about that in a second, but just some physical features. It's a hollow ground blade. That means it has a midrib, and the flats of the blade are kind of scooped inwards. They're concave, so it's quite a light blade for its proportions. It's what we would call an Oakshott Type 18. That means it's a tapering blade, but the edges are kind of bowed outwards, which means it's a good compromise cut and thrust blade. Being bowed outwards, actually, if you think about it, makes it a little bit like a sabre on the edge, as far as the edge is concerned. Gives you a little bit more cutting potential. It adds a little bit of mass to the blade over a Type 15, so over a direct taper. And it actually has a reinforced point. I don't know if you'll be able to see that on here. I think you probably can just about, if I get it near my face. There we go. So it's a bit like a rondel dagger at the point. So we've got a reinforced point for stabbing through mail and gambeson and stuff like that, or whatever else. Bowed out edges, quite good at cutting. But it's not particularly big, as you can see. I think it's, from memory, about 27-28 inch blade. Large crossguard, very big pommel, but hollow. Why have such a big pommel and make it hollow rather than just have a smaller solid one? For any of you that follow Peter Johnson's work, you'll know that proportions and geometry come into medieval design, certainly with architecture, and his theory is that swords are proportioned a certain way because they follow certain formulas in a way, or sort of essentially accepted formats for how a sword should look. That's possible. It could just be pure function. It could be that a large pommel is easier to, index, and it's a bigger hand stop. Essentially, if your hand less likely to slide off. We don't really know. But for whatever reason, they decided to have a big pommel made hollow. That's the characteristics of the sword. Just briefly, this is referred to as the Henry V sword, but there's a very, very good chance that this isn't Henry V's sword. Obviously not this one, but the one in Westminster Abbey. It's a very good chance that it's Henry VII's sword, but we don't know for certain. That's Toby Catpall's theory, and I have been saying a similar thing for quite a while. I don't really think that this is a sword that dates to the beginning of the 15th century. I think it's a sword that dates to the middle or latter part of the 15th century, but that's for another video. What I really want to talk about is I was looking up at this sword on the wall, remembering how much I like it and how much a lovely sword it is, how lovely in the hand it is, how well it cuts. And then I was thinking, actually, one-on-one, if I was just using this against someone using a longer arming sword, because this is a fairly short blade, it's about 27-28 inches. If I was using it against someone who had a longer arming sword or a side sword, definitely something like a rapier, or indeed even something like a sabre, you'd be quite at a disadvantage with this because it's short. And when I have done all of these, for years and years I've done these weapon comparison videos talking about, katana versus longsword, or side sword versus rapier, or sabre versus small sword, whatever. I have literally compared those weapon versus weapon in a 1 versus 1 duel situation, out of armour. That's the context. But we have to remember that all of these different weapon designs came about not because there is one ultimate best sword, but because each weapon is, for whatever reasons, for whatever combination of reasons, best suited to the exact context that that weapon is made for. And that's true of this as well. And I was thinking, what is the context of this? Because this was around at the same time as long swords like this, and indeed the beginnings of side swords. Longish arming swords. This is a short, light, stout, thrusty, fairly cutty arming sword. Why have this particular sword? It's almost, I won't liken it to a gladius, but it's almost like halfway between a gladius and a normal arming sword. It is fairly short. It's a fairly short sword with a very long crossguard. So what is the context for it? Well, I'd be very interested to hear your ideas. I mean, I think its main context is as a sidearm, and I think that often gets overlooked. People look at a weapon and they think about the weapon in isolation and think, what are the good and the bad things about this weapon? But you've got to remember, this weapon was spent most of its time being worn, and specifically, this sword was possibly worn in armour. Now, if you're fighting in armour with a spear or a poleaxe, you know, a main weapon would be a polearm usually, then what do you want from the sword at your side? Well, one thing you absolutely don't want is you don't want a weapon that you're likely to trip over. You also don't want a weapon that is difficult to access when you need it. If your primary weapon's a poleaxe or a glaive or a spear or whatever, if you need to pull out a weapon quickly, it might be in close range, so it might be a weapon you want to be able to use at close range. Stabbing point, hello, perfect for stabbing through gaps in armour, armpits, this kind of thing, holes in people's visors. So you want to get it out quickly, you don't want to fumble it, you want it to be manoeuvrable in a tight space, and you don't want to trip over it, you don't want to get it in the way when you're waving a poleaxe around. Imagine fighting in armour, waving a poleaxe around. If you have a long sword, a really long sword, hilt sticking out, that's going to get in the way of you using your poleaxe. It's going to get in the way of you possibly getting the weapon out. If it's got a long blade, it's difficult to get it out of the scabbard. You might trip over the long blade. Your buddies fighting around you might trip over the long blade. So when you think about context, when you think about a weapon, you've got to think about everything. You've got to think about, where was that weapon worn? Why was it worn? Why was it chosen instead of a longsword? And I find it absolutely fascinating when you can literally sit there staring at a weapon like this next to a weapon like this and know that they were both in use in similar environments, in similar contexts as each other. But for some reason, someone, maybe Henry V, maybe Henry VII, chose this sword, and someone else, whoever, someone like, I don't know, the Earl of Warwick, chose a sword like this. Why? Why did one choose this and why did one choose this? Feel free, as mentioned, to make comments and ideas below. I personally think the reason you choose a sword like this is entirely because you have something else that's your primary weapon, and this is a sidearm. And what you want from a sidearm isn't what you want from a primary weapon. This is something that you want to be easy to wear, easy to access, easy to use in a tight environment like a rondel dagger is, something that you used at very close range, and for very specific purposes. This is predominantly going to be used against people who are lightly armoured and trying to drag you down, cutting edge mostly, and people who are heavily armoured and trying to fight you in armour, nice pointy bit there that you can use in very, very close. And you know, the large crossguard, why might that be so long? It's very distinctive on this sword, very long and curved. Don't really know. I've got various ideas about that, but I'll leave that one to you. Anyway, there we go. I'm going to finish up there. This is a video entirely about context, as you would have seen, but it's very specific. Why did Henry V or Henry VII specifically choose a short cut and thrust sword with a very large pommel and a large crossguard, as opposed to a long sword or a longer arming sword? I think it's fascinating to contemplate that. Let's see what you think below, and see you guys soon. Cheers, folks!